The November wind moved through Harrington, Ohio like something with a grudge. It cut between the federal buildings and swept across the wide stone steps of the Harrington Civic Center with a cold, indifferent precision, scattering the last brown leaves of autumn against the glass facade where a banner had been mounted that morning. The banner was enormous. Navy blue with gold lettering. It stretched nearly 20 feet across the upper face of the building, and it read, Harrington Veterans Recognition Gala, in honor of those who served. Below those words, in smaller but no less deliberate text, hosted by the Office of the Governor of Ohio and the United States Department of Veterans Affairs. The building had been prepared for weeks. The central atrium had been cleared and dressed in ceremony. White linen draped 8-foot tables. Retired officers from 3 branches of the military had been confirmed as attendees. 2 sitting U.S. senators had RSVP'd. The Ohio Secretary of State had sent his confirmation that morning. 3 network television affiliates had credentialed camera crews inside. The event, which would begin formally at 6 o'clock that evening, was already drawing the kind of quiet electricity that follows when institutional power gathers in one room to pay tribute to something it cannot fully comprehend, sacrifice. It was 4:47 in the afternoon when Marcus Webb arrived. He came alone, on foot, having parked his truck 3 blocks west because the municipal lots near the Civic Center were already filling with catering vans and black sedans with government plates. He did not rush. He walked at the deliberate, unhurried pace of a man who has learned that time belongs to those who stop fearing it. He was 54 years old. He was wearing dark gray slacks, a pressed navy blue dress shirt open at the collar, and a charcoal wool overcoat that fit him well. No uniform, no medals, no insignia of any kind. He carried a small leather envelope clutched under one arm, the kind used for formal invitations and correspondence, and his shoes were polished to a quiet, understated shine. He was a black man walking alone toward a government building, and that was all that Derek Colt saw. Colt was stationed at the main entrance. He was 38 years old, broad across the chest, with close-cropped reddish hair and the particular expression that some men wear when they have been handed a small amount of authority and have spent years practicing how to weaponize it. He worked for Sentinel Protective Services, a private security contractor that held the facility management contract for 4 county buildings in the Harrington district. He had worked this post for 6 years. He wore a black uniform with a silver badge clipped to his chest, a radio on his left hip, and gloves he had not bothered to put on because the cold did not seem to touch him the way it touched most people. Or perhaps he simply needed his hands free. There were 2 other guests on the steps ahead of Marcus Webb, a white man and a white woman, both in formal attire, both clutching similar leather invitation envelopes. Colt had nodded them through with a brisk, professional gesture, barely glancing at their documents. He had not asked them for identification. Marcus Webb reached the bottom of the steps. Colt moved, not the half-step aside that signals a doorman clearing space. A direct, planted, deliberate step forward, positioning his body in the center of the entry lane, one hand rising palm outward before Marcus had climbed the first stair. "Hold on," Colt said. Marcus stopped. He looked at the hand, then at Colt's face, then back at the hand. He did not speak immediately. There was a quality to his silence, not submission, not confusion, something quieter and more patient, the kind of quiet that exists on the other side of things most people never have to survive. "This event is by invitation only," Colt said. "Private function. You got something showing you belong here." "I do," Marcus said. His voice was low and level. He produced the leather envelope and opened it, withdrawing a cream-colored card embossed with the seal of the Ohio governor's office. He extended it toward Colt. Colt took it. He looked at it for less than 2 seconds. He handed it back. "This doesn't tell me who you are. This just tells me someone sent a card." "My name is on the card," Marcus said. "Marcus Webb. You can cross-reference it with your guest list." Colt tilted his head slightly, a gesture of performative consideration that carried no actual consideration inside it. He unclipped the laminated guest list from his side panel, a printed roster with the event coordinator's office stamp across the top, and ran his index finger down it with theatrical slowness. He paused once. He looked up. "Says Marcus D. Webb," he said. "That's me. You got a photo ID to confirm that?" Behind Marcus, 2 more guests arrived. Both white, both formally dressed. Colt did not pause the exchange to greet them. He kept his eyes on Marcus. The two guests glanced between the men and entered through the secondary door to the right, pulling it open themselves, unhurried. Marcus reached into his coat and produced his driver's license. He handed it without impatience, his expression unchanged. Colt examined it. The name matched. The face matched. He handed it back, and then he did not move. I'm also going to need to know your relationship to the event, Colt said. What's your reason for attending? I received an invitation, Marcus said. Lots of people receive invitations. This is a high-security function with military personnel, elected officials, and federal representatives. I need to know your specific role. Marcus looked at him. Not a flinch. Not a step back. Just that unblinking, level regard that Colt clearly had not expected and clearly did not like. I'm a guest of the governor's office, Marcus said. In what capacity? That's between me and the governor's office. Colt breathed in slowly. He let the breath out through his nose. He planted his feet slightly wider and dropped his chin, a subtle physical vocabulary that said, I have decided this conversation goes my way. Sir, I'm going to need you to step aside. If you can't verify your attendance, I cannot let you in. We've got a serious event taking place, and I'm not in the business of allowing unverified individuals entry to a secured federal function. Now if you want to wait over there. He gestured to a concrete bench at the far edge of the steps, 10 feet from the entrance, exposed to the full cold of the wind. I can radio inside, and someone can come verify you. You didn't ask the last 4 guests to verify their roles, Marcus said. I know those guests, Colt said. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I don't know you. It was there. In that sentence. Not hidden, not coded. Right there, resting on the surface of it. The word no had nothing to do with recognition. There were 300 people expected at this event. Colt could not possibly have known them all personally. That word meant something else entirely, and everyone within earshot understood what it meant. A young woman near the door, one of the event coordinator's staff, wearing a lanyard and a headset, had turned toward the exchange. Her name was Priya Nair, and she had been working event logistics for 3 years, and she was watching Colt with an expression she was trying to keep professional. She recognized something happening here. She did not yet intervene, because the calculus of intervening against a security contractor in a government building was not a simple one, and she was 26 years old and had been told more than once to let security handle their business. Marcus walked to the concrete bench and sat down. He sat with his back straight, his coat folded across his knees, his hands resting still, and he waited. He looked out over the parking area below, and if there was anything burning behind his eyes, he kept it sealed inside a composure that spoke of long, hard practice. He had learned to wait in places far colder and far darker than a November sidewalk in Ohio. He had learned to hold still while the world moved against him. He had learned this in places this security guard would never visit and could not imagine. Colt radioed inside. This is post 1 at main entry. I've got an unverified individual claiming to be on the guest list. Says his name is Marcus Webb. Needs confirmation before I can allow entry. The radio crackled. A pause. A voice from inside said, spell the last name. WBB. Another pause. Longer this time. The voice came back. He's on the list. He's confirmed. Colt clicked the radio twice and turned to look at the bench. He approached Marcus slowly, his expression recalibrated into something that was trying to pass for professionalism. You're confirmed, he said. You can go in. Marcus stood. He was 3 inches taller than Colt when he stood, and the overcoat settled around him with a quiet authority that the uniform could not replicate. Thank you, Marcus said, though there was nothing grateful in the tone. It was the verbal equivalent of a door closing. He walked to the entrance. Colt stepped aside, minimally. What happened in the next 3 seconds was something Colt would spend a very long time wishing he could take back. As Marcus reached for the door, Colt said, quietly but not quietly enough, because Priya Nair heard it, and a city councilman named Roy Ellison who had just stepped out for air heard it, and a camera operator for Channel 7 News named Sam Detter who had been testing audio settings near the entrance heard it. Colt said, to the junior guard standing beside the door, these people. Every single time. Marcus paused with his hand on the door. He did not turn around. He did not raise his voice. He pushed the door open and walked inside. The atrium of the Harrington Civic Center was grand in the way that public buildings of the 1960s understood grandeur. High marble ceilings, brass fixtures, wide stone floors that amplified footsteps into something ceremonial. Tonight it had been transformed. The round tables with their white linen and candles created a warmth that the architecture alone could never produce. Photographs had been mounted along the east wall, black and white images of veterans from every conflict since Korea, from Harrington and the surrounding counties, men and women in uniform, in the field, in hospitals, in parades. A string quartet was warming up in the far corner. Servers in formal black moved through the early arriving guests with trays of champagne and sparkling water. Marcus moved through the room at the same pace he had walked up the steps. A few people glanced at him. A few offered polite smiles. He was not uncomfortable in the space, and the absence of discomfort was itself a quiet signal to anyone paying close attention, because large rooms full of institutional ceremony have a gravity that pulls on people who don't belong, a restlessness, a compensating performance of confidence, and Marcus showed none of it. He moved through the atrium the way a man moves through a place where his name has already been spoken. He found a table near the window and sat down. He accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing server and set it on the linen in front of him, untouched. At the entrance, Priya Nair had finished her exchange with a caterer and walked back toward the main doors. She passed Roy Ellison, who had come back inside. "Did you hear what that guard said?" Ellison asked her, keeping his voice low. "I heard it," she said. "That's going to be a problem," Ellison said. "It already is," she said. She pulled out her phone. Outside, Sam Detter, the Channel 7 camera operator, had turned to his sound technician and said nothing. He simply gestured with 2 fingers at the main entrance, a small, professional motion that the sound technician understood immediately. And for the next hour, from an unobtrusive position near the beverage table just inside the entrance lobby, Sam Detter kept his camera rolling. He later said, under oath, that he had not been sure why, that something had told him to keep rolling. The same instinct that every camera operator develops after enough years in the field, the instinct that what has already happened is not yet finished. He was not wrong. The event opened formally at 6:12, 12 minutes behind schedule, in the way that large government ceremonies are always precisely imprecise. The MC was a retired Army colonel named Terrence Faust who had a voice built for marble rooms and a bearing that made his retirement feel like a temporary arrangement. He welcomed the attendees, acknowledged the governor's representative, a deputy chief of staff named Alan Whitmore, who had the governor's warm regards and a sharp eye for political liability, and introduced the evening's schedule. There would be remarks. There would be presentations. There would be, at 8:15, the event's central ceremony, the formal reading of commendations and recognition of decorated veterans from the state of Ohio, including, Faust said with a particular weight to his phrasing, a recognition that the state of Ohio and the United States government considered among the highest honors ever extended in this room. At a table in the back, Derek Colt had been reassigned from the external post to interior crowd management at 6 o'clock, standard procedure for the event's active hours. He stood near the wall with his hands clasped, watching the room. He did not notice Marcus Webb at the window table, or perhaps he noticed and chose not to identify what he had noticed. At 6:45, a man entered the atrium from the service corridor, a large man in full military dress uniform, for stars on his shoulders, chest thick with ribbons and decorations, the kind of uniform that does not enter a room quietly no matter how quietly the man wearing it moves. His name was General Raymond T. Callaway, United States Army, the commanding general of United States Army Forces Command, in attendance by direct invitation of the Secretary of Veterans Affairs. He had driven 3 hours from Columbus that afternoon. He had not asked anyone to drive him. He entered the atrium, and his aide moved to his left side to orient him, and General Callaway scanned the room with the practiced efficiency of a man who has spent a career assessing spaces and threats in a single sweep. And then his eyes landed on the window table, and he stopped walking. He looked for exactly 3 seconds. Then he walked directly toward Marcus Webb. People moved out of his path not because they were told to, but because something in his trajectory communicated an absolute purpose, the way water moves around a rock not by choice, but by the immutable logic of force and direction. Marcus Webb looked up from his water glass as the general arrived at his table, and for the first time that evening, something shifted in his expression. It was not surprise. It was recognition. And more than that, The particular warmth that exists between men who have been through something that has no adequate civilian language. Marcus, the general said. Ray, Marcus said. And then General Raymond T. Calloway, commanding general of FORSCOM, for stars and 31 years of active service, extended his hand, and when Marcus Webb shook it, the general covered it with his left hand as well, both of his enormous hands wrapped around Marcus's, and he held it. You look good, the general said. You look tired, Marcus said. The general laughed. It was a short, genuine sound that didn't match the uniform at all, and it turned a dozen heads within 20 feet. They talked for 4 minutes, quietly, leaning toward each other across the table. The general's aide stood at a respectful distance. At the far side of the room, Priya Nair watched them. Beside her, event coordinator Dana Holloway, who had been in charge of the guest list and the ceremony sequence all week, tracked the conversation and then quietly turned to Priya and said, "Does the guard out front know who he turned away?" "He turned him away and then made a comment," Priya said. Dana Holloway went still. "What kind of comment?" Priya told her. Dana Holloway's expression passed through several phases in a span of about 4 seconds. Then she picked up her radio. The clock moved towards 7:30. At the bar in the north corner, 2 junior congressional staffers were discussing the evening's program when one of them, a young man named Patrick G., who had done 2 years in the Army before law school and still tracked military decorations the way some people track sports statistics, glanced at the table near the window and leaned toward his colleague. "Is that Marcus Webb?" he said. "Who?" "Marcus Webb," Patrick G. said again, more slowly, as if the second utterance would mean more. "Silver Star, Distinguished Service Cross," and he lowered his voice further, his eyes fixed on the man at the window table, the medal. His colleague looked at the table. "He doesn't look like, they never do," Patrick said. "That's the whole point. They never look like it when they're just sitting there." He set down his drink and walked toward the table. He approached respectfully, from the front, the way you approach someone whose attention you are not entitled to. "Sergeant Major Webb," he said. Marcus looked up. The title landed in the room, not loudly, but with a precision that carried. "Former," Marcus said. "Just Marcus now." "Patrick G., sir. I served 2 years, 82nd Airborne." He extended his hand. "It is genuinely an honor." The conversation that followed was brief and quiet. But Patrick G. was not the last one. Within the next 20 minutes, 3 more people found their way to the window table. A retired Navy captain, a Gold Star mother from Youngstown whose son had served in the same battalion as Marcus in a deployment nobody at this event would name out loud, and a state senator named Grace Alderman who had spent 6 years on the Veterans Affairs Committee and who arrived at the table with a look on her face that was equal parts reverence, and what she had learned from Priya Nair had happened. At the front door 45 minutes earlier. "Marcus," she said, sitting down without being invited in the way that long familiarity permits. "I've been told there was an incident at the entrance." "There was a misunderstanding," Marcus said. "Was it?" she said. He looked at her for a moment. "It was the kind of misunderstanding that happens very specifically to people who look like me," he said, "at events that are theoretically for people who look like me. So make of that what you will." Senator Alderman made of that exactly what it was. She stood up and walked to where Dana Holloway was standing, and for 2 minutes the 2 women spoke in urgent, quiet tones. At the end of those 2 minutes, Dana Holloway walked to where Deputy Chief of Staff Alan Whitmore was standing near the bar with 2 aides, and she spoke to him. And Whitmore's expression changed in the specific way that the expression of a political operator changes when something manageable has become something irreversible. Behind Whitmore, against the wall, Derek Colt was watching the room. He saw the gathering. He saw the movement. He could not yet connect any of it to himself. At 8:15, Colonel Faust called the room to attention for the recognition ceremony. The program was structured precisely. 7 veterans from across Ohio were recognized in ascending order of distinction: combat service medals, commendation ribbons, Purple Hearts. Each name was read with its full citation. Each recipient stood and was applauded. It was moving, dignified, and proper. The 7th name had not been announced in the printed program. The space in the program where it should have appeared simply read, "Special Recognition." When the 6 preceding veterans had been recognized and seated, Colonel Faust paused at the lectern. He looked down at his notes. Then he looked up, and something in his posture changed. Something that had already been formal became something more. the way a flag straightens in a sudden wind. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "the United States military has 71 grades of decoration. They range from unit citations to campaign medals to awards for valor in combat. Most of these awards, even the highest among them, are known to the military community and understood in their significance by those who've served. But there is one decoration in the United States military that carries a weight that transcends rank, transcends branch, transcends the entire institutional framework within which all others exist. It is the nation's highest military honor. It is awarded not by superior officers, not by institutional committee alone, but by the President of the United States, in the name of Congress, to members of the armed forces who distinguish themselves through conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty." The room was perfectly quiet. Of all Americans alive today who have received this honor, fewer than 70 remain. Fewer than 70. Of those, an extraordinary few are residents of this state. Tonight, one of them is in this room. Derek Colt, standing against the north wall, felt the first cold touch of something he could not yet name. Sergeant Major Marcus Darius Webb, United States Army Special Forces, retired. Faust's voice did not increase in volume. It did not need to. On the night of March 14, 2005, in the Kunar province of Afghanistan, Sergeant Major Webb's 12-man Special Operations team was ambushed by an insurgent force of more than 40. In the engagement that followed, Webb, already wounded by shrapnel in the first volley of fire, returned again and again into direct enemy contact to carry 3 incapacitated soldiers out of the kill zone, neutralizing multiple enemy combatants in close quarters to do so. After evacuating the 3rd soldier to cover, he then occupied a forward fighting position alone and held it against the advancing force for 22 minutes, until air support arrived, preventing the complete encirclement and annihilation of his team. 9 of the 12 men on that team are alive today because of what he did in those 22 minutes. Not one person in the room moved. For his actions that night, Sergeant Major Marcus Webb was awarded the Medal of Honor by the President of the United States in a White House ceremony in 2007. He subsequently declined a position of senior advisory rank to return to Ohio, where he has spent the years since working with veteran reintegration programs and mentoring young men and women from underserved communities. He requested that tonight's recognition be low-key. He asked that his introduction be kept brief. Faust paused. He looked out over the room. "Sergeant Major Webb," he said quietly, "nothing about what you did that night was brief. This room is not capable of brief, and I think you know it." The applause began. It was not the performative kind. It began in the back of the room where Patrick G. was standing, and within 4 seconds it had filled every corner of the marble ceiling, and people were on their feet, and General Calloway, 4 stars, 31 years, a man who had clapped for presidents and kings, was on his feet with his hands together and an expression that was not a performance of anything. Marcus Webb stood up from the window table and walked to the front of the room. He walked the same way he had walked up the Civic Center steps. Unhurried, straight, with that quality of self-possession that has nothing to do with pride and everything to do with certainty. He wore no medal. He did not need to. He shook Colonel Faust's hand and stood at the lectern, and he looked out at the room for a moment before he spoke. Derek Colt, from his position against the wall, could now see the face of the man he had called these people. He could see the 4 stars on the general who had shaken that man's hand. He could see the standing ovation that had not yet subsided. He could see Senator Alderman's expression, which was no longer looking at the lectern but had turned, with cold deliberateness, toward the north wall, toward Colt. And Colt felt, for the first time in 6 years of wearing that uniform, genuinely afraid. Marcus Webb did not speak about himself at the lectern. He spoke about the 8 soldiers who had not walked away from the Kunar province that night. Not the 3 he had carried, but the other 8, including a 22-year-old from Columbus named Darnell Okafor whose mother, Webb said, had sent him a jar of homemade cookies every month for the 9 months of that deployment, and who had never come home to taste any they made together. He spoke about the veteran programs he ran in Harrington and Akron, about the young men who came to them broken in ways that did not show up on X-rays, and about what it meant to have survived something and still be expected to simply return to a country that did not always know what to do with you when you got there. He spoke for 7 minutes. He did not once raise his voice. When he finished, the room stood again, and this time it took longer for the applause to stop. While the room was still on its feet, Priya Nair walked to where Derek Colt was standing and placed her phone in front of him, screen up. On the screen was the video, Sam Detter's footage from the entrance, captured on a personal phone by someone who had been standing near the door for the opening 10 minutes of what Detter had captured. A shorter clip, but perfectly clear. Colt's posture, the palm, the demand for verification. The guests waved through without question, and then, sharp, plain, unmistakable, the three words. These people. Every single time. Colt looked at the screen. His face did something complicated and irreversible. This was recorded, he said. Multiple sources, Priya said. Her voice was professionally flat, the tone of someone who is choosing every word with care because she knows what comes next will be documented. 2 camera feeds, Mr. Detter's footage, and at least 1 independent bystander video that has already been posted to social media. She said that last part quietly, but she said it. Colt looked back at the lectern where Marcus Webb was stepping down to the continued applause of a room that included a 4-star general, a state senator, 2 congressional staffers, a deputy chief of staff to the governor, and the representatives of 3 federal departments. He looked at the standing ovation. He looked at the man in the navy shirt and charcoal overcoat who was shaking hands and nodding and moving through the room with the ease of a man who has never needed a room to approve of him. Colt set his radio down on the table beside him. He didn't do it dramatically. He set it down the way a man sets down something he already knows he will never pick up again. At 8:59, Alan Whitmore made a phone call. He stepped into a side corridor, and the conversation lasted 4 minutes. The person on the other end of the call was a senior advisor in the governor's office, a woman named Sharon Bellew who had spent 11 years managing political fallout and who did not require a full briefing to understand the scale of what had occurred. She asked 3 questions. Whitmore answered them. At the end of the call, she said, "I need the footage, the guard's name, and his employer's contract number within the hour." He gave her all 3 within 40 minutes. At 9:17, Dana Holloway received a call from the CEO of Sentinel Protective Services, a man named Gerald Fitch who had learned about the incident through a contact at the venue management office, who had learned about it from a building manager, who had learned about it from a server who had seen the social media post that was already accumulating attention with a caption that read, "Security guard Harris's black veteran tells colleague these people at Veterans Day Gala." The post had 700 shares by 9 o'clock. By 11, it had 40,000. Fitch told Holloway that Derek Colt had been suspended pending investigation, effective immediately. He did not wait to be asked. Colt had already left the building by then. He had walked out at 9:04, through the service exit, past the catering equipment and the recycling bins, into the cold Ohio night, without his radio, without speaking to his supervisor, without being formally dismissed from his post, a detail that his employment file would later note as abandonment of duty, which sat alongside the footage and the formal complaints in a file that grew considerably thicker over the following 3 weeks. That night, the video reached 200,000 views before midnight. It reached 1 million by the following morning. By 48 hours after the event, it had been picked up by 4 national news networks, 2 of which led with it on their morning broadcasts. The headline that most outlets settled on was some variation of the same devastating irony. Security guard removes black veteran from Veterans Day Gala. Man was Medal of Honor recipient honored at the event. The cruelty of the irony required no editorial elaboration. The facts carried their own weight. Marcus Webb did not appear on any of the morning broadcasts. He issued a statement through a veterans organization he had co-founded, 3 paragraphs long, that addressed not the individual incident but the pattern beneath it. He wrote that the experience at the Civic Center door had been, in his view, neither unprecedented nor isolated. That the specific degradation of being presumed not to belong in a space that has been built partly in your name and in the name of people like you is a particular kind of wound that does not heal on a news cycle. He wrote that he did not hold personal anger toward the individual involved, but that personal anger was not the relevant framework. The relevant framework, he wrote, was accountability, not as punishment, but as consequence, the specific mechanism by which institutions signal to themselves and to the public whether certain behaviors are acceptable or not. The statement was measured and disciplined. It was also devastating in the way that measured, disciplined statements become when the facts behind them are explosive. By the end of the day on which it was published, it had been quoted in a United States Senate hearing on racial discrimination in federal facility security contracting, a hearing that had, by coincidence of legislative calendar, been scheduled for that week entirely independently of what had happened in Harrington, Ohio, but which became something different on the day that 3 senators held up Marcus Webb's statement and asked the Secretary of Veterans Affairs what the federal government intended to do. The Secretary of Veterans Affairs, a retired general herself, did not read from prepared remarks. She said, standing at the hearing table, that she found the incident at the Harrington Civic Center morally reprehensible, professionally indefensible, and entirely consistent with a pattern of discriminatory behavior by private security contractors in federally contracted facilities that her office had been documenting for 14 months without adequate legislative mandate to act on. She said that she intended to use this moment. She said it without hedging, without the usual diplomatic architecture of institutional language. The senators gave her 30 additional minutes of testimony. She used every one of them. In the weeks that followed, the Ohio Attorney General's office opened a civil rights investigation into Sentinel Protective Services. Investigators subpoenaed 4 years of incident reports, complaint logs, and personnel files from the company's 7 Ohio locations. What they found was not a surprise to the investigators, who had worked these cases long enough to know what to look for, but it was documented for the first time with the kind of thoroughness that cannot be dismissed. A pattern of disparate treatment at entry points. Complaints from Black and Latino guests at 3 separate federally contracted venues, filed over 4 years, marked as resolved without investigation, buried in a category in the incident management software labeled Other, a category that the software's user manual noted was intended for incidents not classified under any specific reportable type. 41 complaints in 41 months. Marked Other. Uninvestigated. 2 of the complaints had been filed by veterans. The civil rights investigators brought those 2 veterans in for interviews. One of them had been turned away from a discharge processing ceremony at a VA-affiliated facility in Dayton. The other had been detained at the entrance to a military family housing office in Columbus for 20 minutes, while a white civilian consultant was admitted without question. Both men were Black. Both had been turned away by Sentinel employees. Derek Colt had not worked at either of those facilities. That was the point. The pattern was not a single guard. The pattern was a company culture, a hiring practice, an absence of training, and a deliberate systemic burying of evidence. And it had existed in plain sight inside a filing category called Other for 3.5 years. Gerald Fitch, the CEO of Sentinel Protective Services, hired a crisis communications firm on the 4th day after the story broke. The firm's first recommendation was a public statement of apology and the announcement of a company-wide diversity and sensitivity training program. Fitch released the statement. It was widely reported. It was also widely noted that the statement did not contain the words civil rights, discrimination, or investigation, and that the training program was described as voluntary. The Attorney General's office noted the same absence and moved faster. On December 8, 26 days after the Veterans Day Gala, Sentinel Protective Services was served with a formal civil rights violation notice under Ohio Revised Code Section 4112, covering discrimination in public accommodations and places of public contract. The notice identified 9 specific incidents, including the Harrington Civic Center incident, as constituting a pattern of racially discriminatory conduct in the performance of state-contracted security services. It named Gerald Fitch and 2 regional operations managers as individually liable parties. The state contract, a 4-year, $12 million agreement for security services at 17 county and state facilities, was suspended pending resolution. Fitch's crisis communications firm resigned the account 4 days later. On December 14th, a federal civil rights complaint was filed with the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, co-signed by the Ohio ACLU, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and a coalition of veterans advocacy organizations that had formed in the 2 weeks since the story broke. The federal complaint expanded the scope of investigation beyond Sentinel to include the oversight failures of the facility management contractors who had held the Sentinel contract without adequate monitoring provisions. The language of the complaint was precise. It cited specific federal statutes. It attached 41 complaint records, all formerly marked other. It attached Sam Detter's footage, Priya Nair's sworn statement, Roy Ellison's sworn statement, and the audio transcript of Colt's radio communication in which he described Marcus Webb as an unverified individual, the timestamp of which was 47 seconds after he had waved through the last of 4 white guests without any verification request. 47 seconds. The complaint's authors had chosen to include that timestamp not as rhetoric, but as evidence. 47 seconds between equal treatment and unequal treatment. Less than a minute. The span of a single decision, made automatically, without reflection, the way that reflexes operate, because reflexes are what habits become. Derek Colt's termination from Sentinel Protective Services was made official on December 2nd, 4 days after the story broke. The termination letter cited conduct unbecoming a security professional, violation of the company's equal treatment policy, and abandonment of post. It did not cite civil rights violations, because citing civil rights violations in a termination letter would have been an admission. His union grievance was filed on December 5th. By December 20th, the union had quietly withdrawn it following a conversation between the union's legal counsel and the Attorney General's office that no one publicly described in detail, but whose outcome was clear. Colt had retained a private attorney, a man named Harold Stump who practiced employment law out of an office in Findlay and who had spent his career telling people their positions were stronger than they were. Stump's initial statement to the press was that his client had followed standard security protocol, had made no explicitly discriminatory statements, and that the characterization of the incident as a civil rights violation was inflammatory and legally unsupported. Sam Detter's footage was shown at the press conference where Harold Stump said this. A reporter from the Columbus Dispatch waited for the footage to finish and then said, simply, "Mr. Stump, your client can be heard saying," and I quote, "these people, every single time. Can you explain what your client meant?" Stump said that the phrase was ambiguous and that context was required to interpret it. The reporter said, "What context would you suggest?" Stump said he couldn't speculate. The reporter said, "Can you tell us what other context there might be at a Veterans Day gala, at which your client had just spent 8 minutes demanding documentation from a black guest he could not claim to know, while waving through 4 white guests without any documentation request?" Stump's statement to the press was not carried by any major outlet beyond its initial reporting. His client's name was. The Ohio Civil Rights Commission hearing was scheduled for February 18th. Marcus Webb was not required to attend. He attended anyway, accompanied by his attorney, a woman named Dr. Camille Osei, who had clerked for the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals and who had represented civil rights cases for 20 years with a record that other attorneys studied. He sat at the table in the hearing room in the same navy shirt and charcoal overcoat. He did not wear the medal that day, either. He wore it on no day that was not a ceremony specifically requiring it, because he had always understood the difference between what a decoration represents and what it takes to earn one, and he would not reduce the first to assert the second. The hearing was 3 hours long. The commission chair, a woman named Dr. Patricia Wells, who had served in the role for 9 years, presided with a thoroughness that left no space for procedural evasion. Every complaint marked other was entered into the record. Every timestamp discrepancy. Every entry log showing differential treatment at Sentinel-managed facilities over 4 years. Colt's employment record was entered, including a prior complaint from 2021, filed by a black attorney at a county courthouse facility, that had been resolved as unsubstantiated after a 2-day internal review conducted by a Sentinel supervisor who had since been named as one of the individually liable parties in the civil rights notice. The 2021 complaint had been marked other. Gerald Fitch testified for 40 minutes. He was measured and institutional and expressed deep regret, while simultaneously characterizing the company's failures as systemic oversights rather than deliberate policy. Dr. Osei's cross-examination took 37 minutes. By the end of it, Fitch had acknowledged, under questioning, that he had personally reviewed the incident reporting categories in 2020 and had approved the broadened use of the other classification without requesting a review protocol for incidents placed in that category. He had approved the mechanism of burial while the pattern was already in motion. Dr. Wells' questions, after Osei's cross-examination concluded, were quieter and more precise. She asked Fitch one question that the room waited for him to answer and that he answered, after a long pause, in a way that was worse than anything he could have said directly. She asked, "Mr. Fitch, in your understanding of your company's equal treatment policy, the policy that Derek Colt's termination letter cited him as violating, what is the purpose of that policy?" Fitch said, "To ensure that all guests at facilities we manage are treated with the same level of professional courtesy and respect," Dr. Wells said. "And in your 14 years as CEO of Sentinel Protective Services, were you ever made aware of any instance in which a guest at a facility you manage complained that they were not treated with that level of courtesy and respect?" A pause. "Yes," Fitch said. "How many times?" Another pause. "Longer. I don't have the exact figure." "Would it surprise you," Dr. Wells said, without inflection, "to learn that figure is 41? The room was quiet. "No," Fitch said, very quietly. "Why not?" she said. He didn't answer. She let the silence hold for a long time before she moved to the next question. The Commission's formal finding, issued on March 4th, determined that Sentinel Protective Services had engaged in a pattern of racially discriminatory conduct at multiple Ohio facilities in violation of Ohio Revised Code Section 4112.02. That Gerald Fitch, as CEO, bore executive responsibility for the systemic failure to investigate and address documented complaints, and that the company's contract suspension was to be made permanent pending a comprehensive remediation audit that the Commission itself would oversee. The finding assessed civil penalties of $840,000, the maximum permissible under applicable statute, and referred the matter to the Department of Justice for potential federal action under Title II of the Civil Rights Act. The finding also included, in its final section, a passage that was not standard Commission language. Dr. Wells had written it herself. It read, "The Commission finds it necessary to state plainly that the specific harm in this case is not merely procedural. It is not an organizational oversight or a documentation failure. It is the particular injury of a man who served his country at a cost that most of us cannot comprehend being told, in the most dismissive and deliberate way, that he did not belong in a room built to honor him." The Commission's findings address the institutional and legal dimensions of that harm. What no legal finding can fully address is the human one. We name it here because to proceed to remediation without naming it would be a lesser form of justice than this moment requires. The passage was read into the public record. Senator Grace Alderman, who was in the hearing room, later entered it into the congressional record, where it joined Marcus Webb's original 3-paragraph statement. Marcus Webb was in the front row when the finding was read aloud. He sat with his hands folded on the table, his posture straight, and he listened to every word. When it was finished, he did not speak to the press gathered outside the Commission chamber, not because he had nothing to say, but because the moment had already said what needed saying, and he had learned, in the 20 years since the Cunner province, that the most important discipline available to a man is knowing when his presence alone is the statement. He stood on the Commission building steps in the February cold, the same charcoal overcoat, the same unhurried stillness, and he shook Dr. Camille Osei's hand, and then they walked to their respective cars, and he drove home. He drove through the parts of Harrington that do not appear in Civic Center events, through the neighborhood where his veteran reintegration office had been operating for 11 years out of a converted insurance building on Fairfield Avenue, a place with folding chairs and donated coffee machines, and no marble anywhere, where men and women came when the world they had returned to felt like a foreign country, and the skills they had trained for years to develop had no civilian application, and the damage they carried had no civilian vocabulary. He parked in front of it and sat in the truck for a moment, watching the windows. 2 lights were on inside. His program director, a former staff sergeant named Angela Brow, kept the office open until 9 on Tuesdays and Thursdays. It was a Thursday. He went inside. He didn't have a meeting that night. He just sat in the back office and drank bad coffee and read through the intake forms from the previous week. 7 new veterans, ages ranging from 23 to 59, from conflicts ranging from Desert Storm to a deployment that had ended 8 months ago, all of them trying to locate themselves in a country that had, in various specific and unspecific ways, told them that the version of themselves they had brought home was not the version that fit. He read every form. He wrote notes in the margins. He set each one down as though it was something that deserved to be set down with care. Angela Brown knocked on the door at 8:45. She had been watching the news on her phone in the front office, and she had the specific expression of someone who wants to say something and is choosing their words. "You doing all right?" she said. "I'm reading," he said. She nodded. She stood in the doorway for another moment. "That thing today," she said. "The commission. The finding. You know what that means for the programs, right? The money they froze in the contract review might get redirected toward veteran services outreach. Senator Alderman's office called today. They want a meeting." "I know," he said. "That's something," she said. He looked at the intake form in his hands. The name at the top was a 24-year-old woman who had done 2 tours and come home to an apartment she couldn't afford and a family that didn't know what to say to her. "It's a start," he said. Angela Brow went back to the front office. He heard the coffee maker running, the hiss of it, the particular domestic sound of a building where someone is still trying. Outside, on the street, a city bus moved past the window in a slow, heavy arc of headlights, and the night beyond it was cold and ordinary and full of the kind of weight that does not lift quickly but lifts. Derek Colt applied for 2 security positions in the following months and was declined by both. His name appeared in the Civil Rights Commission's public findings as a named individual in the pattern of discriminatory conduct, not as the architect of it, but as its most visible instrument, which was in certain ways a more permanent kind of damage. He was not arrested. No criminal statute had been definitively violated in a form that produced an indictment. What he faced instead was the slower, harder consequence of having done something that could not be taken back in a world where what could not be taken back was now stored in servers and archives and hearing records and the memory of a room that had been standing when he said it. He moved to a different county. He found work eventually, in a different field, with a different name on a different kind of badge. Whether the internal architecture of the man who wore that badge had changed in any fundamental way was a question that no legal finding, no civil penalty, no commission hearing could answer. Some reckonings are institutional. Some are personal. The institutional ones are the only ones that can be documented and enforced. The personal ones are between a man and whatever he looks at when the room is empty and the uniform is off. Gerald Fitch resigned from Sentinel Protective Services on March 12, 8 days after the commission's finding. The board accepted his resignation and issued a statement thanking him for his service and expressing their commitment to a reformed company culture. An interim CEO was named, a woman with a background in compliance and civil rights law, brought in specifically to conduct the remediation audit the commission had ordered. The audit would take 8 months. Its findings would be submitted to the commission and to the Department of Justice. Whether the company survived in its current form was, at the time of the audit's commencement, genuinely uncertain. The 41 veterans and guests whose complaints had been marked other were each contacted individually by the Commission's outreach office and offered a formal acknowledgement of their complaint, a written apology from the Commission on behalf of the contracting process that had failed them, and a referral to civil counsel for individual remedy proceedings. 37 of them responded. 34 pursued individual civil claims. None of them became famous. None of them stood at a lectern in a marble room. None of them had a citation that could be read aloud to a standing ovation. They had simply been turned away or detained or made to feel, at the door of a place that was supposed to serve them, that they did not belong there. That was the population that Marcus Webb's statement had named, not himself, but them, the ones without the citations, the ones whose treatment had been exactly the same, but whose names had not carried the institutional weight to make it visible. He had not asked to be a symbol. Symbols are chosen by circumstance, not character. But he understood, with the same disciplined clarity that had kept 9 men alive in a mountain valley in Afghanistan, that what had happened to him on those steps had also happened to men and women who would never have a general arrive at their table, would never have a colonel read their citation to a standing room, would never have their story reach 40 million views and a Senate hearing. He understood that the reason to fight was not his own dignity. His own dignity had been intact before he walked up those steps and remained intact after, because dignity is not something that can be removed by a man with a radio clipped to his belt. The reason to fight was the architecture, the system of small, unspoken permissions that allowed the behavior to repeat and repeat and repeat and land in a filing category called Other, where it sat until someone decided the weight of it was no longer ignorable. He had made it no longer ignorable, not by raising his voice, not by confrontation, not by allowing the provocation of a cold sidewalk and a palm held flat in his face to pull him out of the stillness that 20 years of hard living had built inside him. He had made it no longer ignorable by walking inside, by sitting at the window table, by shaking a general's hand and accepting a glass of water and waiting, with the patience of a man who has outlasted worse things than impatience, for the room to understand what it had in it. The Harrington Civic Center removed the incident from its management incident log as a routine security matter and reclassified it as a civil rights incident, effective retroactively from the date of occurrence, as required by the Commission's finding. A small change in category, in a database field, in a building most people would never enter. But small changes in categories are how institutions confess to themselves. And confession, even institutional, is the precondition for anything that might, with work and time and enough people who refuse to walk away, become something better. The November banner had come down weeks before any of this was resolved. The Civic Center had moved on to its December programming, holiday concerts, a Chamber of Commerce dinner, a youth orchestra recital. The stone steps had been salted against the ice and the leaves had been cleared, and the building presented its glass face to the street with the same indifferent permanence that public buildings maintain regardless of what has happened inside them. But the record of what had happened inside it, in the hearing room and in the atrium and on those steps, was filed in 3 governmental databases, entered into the congressional record, cited in a federal civil rights complaint, and taught in a continuing education course on discriminatory practices in security contracting that a professor at Ohio State developed the following spring. The professor assigned Marcus Webb's 3-paragraph statement as the opening reading of the course. She told her students on the first day that she had chosen it not because it was famous, but because it was precise, because it had named the mechanism without losing sight of the person, because it had asked for accountability without performing outrage, which is the harder thing and the more useful one. She read the final line of the statement aloud to the classroom. The line read, "The question that matters is not what happened to me. The question that matters is what we do with the answer about why it keeps happening." She set the paper down on the lectern. She looked at the room full of students who were going to go into law, policy, institutional management, government service, security administration, event coordination, facilities contracting, and every other ordinary professional life in which, on any given afternoon, a decision is made about who belongs at a door. She said, "Hold that question." She said it the way you say something when you mean for it to stay.